The Israeli military carries out strikes in and around Tehran as Iran's foreign minister travels to Geneva for crucial talks with his European counterparts. Iran fires more missiles at southern Israel as the conflict enters a second week. The Kremlin warns the Middle East is plunging into an abyss of instability and war. And more than 50 Palestinians are killed in Gaza, many while waiting for food at distribution sites. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is due to arrive in Geneva to meet his counterparts from the UK, France and Germany, known as the E3. The meetings to discuss the conflict between Iran and Israel as it moves into its second week. It's the first major diplomatic effort on the issue since hostilities began with Israel's first attacks. Well, ahead of the talks, the Iranian foreign minister told Iranian state TV that Tehran has refused US diplomatic approaches since the missile strikes began.
At the
present time, while the Zionist entity's aggression against us continues, we don't wish to engage in dialogue with any party. The United States wants dialogue and has sent several serious messages in this regard, and we've frankly emphasized to them that it's impossible to talk about negotiations while the aggression and assault against our country continues. We're engaged in legitimate defense of our country, and this defense won't stop. There's no dialogue with Washington, which is considered a partner in these crimes. Some countries have contacted us, made proposals and sought mediation, but we've had no contact or communication with Washington, and we'll not engage with them under the current circumstances. Washington asked us to negotiate. We refused.
Well, the talks in Geneva come after US President Donald Trump said he'll decide whether the US will get involved in the Israel-Iran conflict in the next 2 weeks. The White House press secretary has said Trump remains hopeful about talks with Iran. The president said he may or may not join Israel's strikes on Iran and has repeated his call for Tehran's, quote, unconditional surrender. Well, Tahir Asadi is in Tehran for us. Noor Odeh is in Amman. She's there because the Israeli government's banned Al Jazeera from operating in Israel and the occupied territories. Milena Veselinovic is standing by for us in Geneva, where those talks are due to get underway. Milena, obviously a lot of press interest in what is going to be happening in Geneva. If Iran isn't willing to hold talks, what are the Europeans hoping to achieve?
Well, they are hoping to achieve, Rob, some sort of a diplomatic headway. I think they consider the fact that Abbas Araghchi is willing to come here to Geneva a very positive step, even though, as we just heard, he did say that Iran can't or won't negotiate while they're still under fire from Israel. However, there is hope by these European nations and their foreign ministers of UK, France and Germany that they could potentially do something today that could stop the escalation of this conflict from widening into the region and make the situation even worse than it is today. Of course, there are major caveats. One thing that's quite important is that the Americans are not at the table here today on Friday in Geneva. However, the UK Foreign Minister, David Lammy, who will be at the talks today, did meet with Marco Rubio, his US counterpart, the US Secretary of State, on Thursday in Washington. He also met with Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's Middle East envoy. So
মেসওয়াক পাউডারের ইউজেস নিয়ে আর কি বলবো, এটা আসলে অনেকভাবে করা যায় আর কি। বিশেষ করে আমি যেটা করি, আমি এটা থেকে পাউডার এরকম হাতে নিয়ে, সুন্দর সিস্টেমটা আলহামদুলিল্লাহ, এই পরিমাণ অল্প পরিমাণ নিলে কিন্তু হয়। এটা টুথপেস্ট যেরকম অনেক
it is thought that he will be bringing the messages and the views from Washington to the talks here today. Now, we do know that the US and Iran have held multiple rounds of nuclear talks in the last few months. They did not make a lot of headway. There was an impasse over how much Iran could be allowed to enrich uranium. The US side was saying, well, they can't enrich any uranium whatsoever on their own soil. The Iranians were saying that was not acceptable to them. The Americans also wanted to include Iran's ballistic program as part of these talks, and the Iranian side saying, well, that's a completely separate thing. We should not be talking about that. So there were quite significant differences. Now, it is not thought that either of the sides had changed their position significantly. So it is quite doubtful. It does hang in the balance how much progress can actually be made here today on Friday in Geneva.
It's going to be interesting, though, because, I mean, if I remember correctly, France, Germany and the UK were the European signatories to the original 2015 nuclear deal. They also objected, of course, when Donald Trump pulled out of that deal a few years later. How much leverage do you think that gives them with Iran when it comes to talks like this?
Yeah, they were part of those original signatories of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, a deal that US President Donald Trump pulled out of in 2018. During his first term as president, those countries did try to keep the deal going without the US, but it simply wasn't possible to do that because their financial mechanisms just couldn't engage with the Iranian economy while still respecting the US sanctions. I think just the fact that Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, is willing to meet the foreign ministers of these European countries is significant. There is scope for diplomacy here. There's been that 2-week breather that's been signaled by US President Donald Trump. In terms of leverage, really, what the Europeans can do is act as a bridge between Washington and Iran. And that is why the UK Foreign Minister David Lammy visited Washington on Thursday. And really, the only thing they can do is exert pressure diplomatically on both sides to try to reach some sort of a diplomatic deal.
Milena, thank you very much indeed for breaking that down for us. Milena Veselinovic there in Geneva. Well, the diplomatic talks come as Iran carries out new strikes on southern Israel. Sirens have been sounding in Beersheba and nearby towns. Iran says the attack on a city targeted a technology park housing military and cyber institutions. The Israeli army says an interceptor missile was launched in response. Israeli air attacks have also been carried out across Iran overnight. Missiles hit the outskirts of the northern city of Rasht and explosions lit up the skies over Tehran. We're going to go to Tahir Asadi in the Iranian capital, Tehran. The attacks obviously continuing at the same time as there are efforts at least to try to find some grounds for discussions in Geneva. Just remind us what Iran's position is going into these talks.
Oh, well, actually, we have to take into consideration that this very recent development taking place, diplomatically speaking, takes place under a context in which Iran continues to see these strikes by the Israeli side. And just a couple of hours ago, we've got this report about explosion taking place in central parts of Tehran. And we've got now unconfirmed reports about the assassination of another nuclear scientist. From the very day one of these strikes, Iran has been witnessing the continuation of these strikes, and military officials, top nuclear scientists, and also very ordinary citizens are getting killed, including women and children. The public mood here is extremely when we speak to people, they are extremely angry about that. But speaking of the very recent important developments taking place on the ground in Geneva, they are facing with a couple of points. First, Iran is trying to send out this message that still there is a possibility, as far as Tehran is concerned, for diplomatic way to settle down the issue. But still, there is this optimistic cautiousness that we can see, speaking of the statements that we hear from Iranian officials, including Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, who came out ahead of this visit to give an interview to the state TV, saying that we are not there for negotiations. We are there as we have been invited by the Europeans, and we are going to listen. So at this point, talks do not seem, at least from Iranian perspective, that much meaningful. If you look at the statements coming from Iranian president, Iranian supreme leader, and other officials, you can see the echo of the same statement that we just heard from the Iranian foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. They are all saying that as long as Israeli strikes continue, and the reality on the ground is that they continue on now an hourly basis, we're not going there, we're not going to talk, we're not going to get engaged in negotiations, but still, they're trying to send out the message that possibility is still out there. We heard the same thing on an X account by the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who came out to say that as long as the Israelis continue their strikes, their aggressions, we're going to strike back, and retaliation is going to be more and more crushing. And speaking of the latest developments, from day one, we are seeing Iranian retaliatory courses of action taken by military forces of the country, and each day we see sort of next step taken by the militaries using more advanced weaponry, more advanced missiles to strike back the Israelis targeting Iranian different territories. And now we have to keep in mind that it's getting to an unprecedented, dangerous level with a possibility of U.S. intervention into this already intricate, complicated scenario. And the Iranians on that are very clear. They're saying that if that happens, that runs the risk of a further escalation and a regional war which is going to take place if that happens.